is your objectives and end of the term source, because this will be the last public hearing from the Public Accounts Committee in this term. Just before we'll start the hearing, I would like to say, in the interest of the time, apologize in advance, we will need to interrupt when we would like to go into the details, just to ensure that we are clarifying the points that we would like to make. And the first part of this public hearing will be about COVID-19 follow-up review and preparedness of Jersey for the hopefully not emergency event. And I'll hand to Deputy Wilson.
Thank you. Mr McLaughlin, the PSC notes that following the COVID-19 pandemic, there were multiple recommendations from various sources regarding the government's response. Can you advise the committee how you feel the government has done implementing these recommendations?
Sure. I think there were about 100 recommendations, which is par for the course in Jersey. Obviously, I wasn't around in government or in this role in pandemic, but was leading another organisation in Jersey. But I'm bound to say, again, for the record, my admiration for the people who did lead through the pandemic in preparation for this, from speaking to colleagues in health and police and elsewhere. There was universal praise for the leadership at the time, the crisis management leadership through the pandemic. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and indeed acknowledge how well it's been anchored by the Chief Officer of Justice and Home Affairs for a number of years now, not just the pandemic but other incidents. And finally, to say, certainly during my time, there have been incidents, not of course necessarily of the same scale, but that has given me some insight into how much of a sort of muscle memory and discipline crisis management and response to resiliency events has become in public service. So I'm quite encouraged about that. The main thing, of course, we've been doing is the Crisis Resilience Improvement Plan, the new frameworks, the risk registers, which we've discussed in the past, but particularly, of course, the resiliency risk register, the resiliency forum is the main way in which we've sought to embed in governance how we don't just learn from the pandemic, but continually learn. As I say, there's been a number of very serious incidents on the island since the pandemic, and all of those are contributing. The public health and emergency planning functions, of course, have changed in response to the pandemic and play a key role here. And again, I would say in areas like public health, a noticeable thing for me coming in fresh to the organisation is how we've improved in those areas, how those functions, if you like, have become seen as important as maybe longer standing functions of government, being relatively new.
What would you say the top 3 learning points from that analysis?
From my seat now, because I tend to focus on the top ones, I think definitely arriving at the point where we realise that the right structure for coordinated leadership and monitoring and analysis is the Jersey Resilience Forum, and that we needed that island-wide risk register, not just our corporate risk registers and departmental risk registers. I think that was very important. I think the second thing that was very important was recognising what you didn't have. Obviously, we've done a lot of work with Guernsey in terms of having permanent resiliency and crisis management structures in place. And I would say the third one, learning, is communication. Is the role of communication in crisis management is very, very important. And again, I need to be humble here because I wasn't around at the time, but the feedback from colleagues when I've asked them is that there's been a material improvement in this area from how things were pre-pandemic. And I think if I observe, although they're not comparable, how we responded to things like Storm Ciarán, if I observe the approach to Haut-du-Mont, albeit it was well underway and I just had to play a part in its later stages, I've quite encouraged that these in these areas you can see us learning, and I think you can see us being more effective as a government. So those would be the three that
Can I
I would pick out.
Clarify, so the first one, it was island-wide corporate risk register. The last one, communication. I wasn't sure if you can clarify what we didn't have in place, which was the second one, and what we have now. I missed it.
Well, we
So-
didn't have we didn't have a resiliency forum in place, as I understand it, unless you want to correct me if I'm wrong. Obviously, I wasn't here, but I think that's new. And I also think the way in which we are have put together risk assess and now track the risk register, JR, or the old community risk register, I think that's a change as well. So
If a pandemic were to hit tomorrow, what do you think we would do differently?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here, and I should say that we've just, of course, gone through a major exercise this winter, coordinated by the UK government, effectively a pandemic-style scenario, both to test our draft improvement plan and test our infrastructure. So I think the main difference from then to now would be that we have functions within the public service which are really dedicated to dealing with incidents of this nature. Obviously, some of that is shared infrastructure with Guernsey. I think in areas like public health and in emergency planning functions, there's lessons have been learned and embedded into to those functions. And I think that in an integrated way, reflecting the coordination that you need. And I also think that you can see, as I've mentioned, that from a communications perspective, in the face of a crisis, I believe we've learned a lot of lessons. You know, I think people would be hard put to say that the response to the recent storms and other incidents hasn't been pretty effective from government, albeit I would never compare each incident to the other, but the disciplines you require to respond to an incident, I think, are comparable.
Do you have a final decision maker within that forum? Is there a final decision maker that says, right, this is the person, is the go-to person to make that final critical?
In terms of different forums, you're going up to and including the Chief Minister, depending on what the...
He would make that final decision on what?
Depending on what the severity is. You also have people with really important roles with statutory independence, like, you know, public health and so forth, where, so when you say ultimate decision maker, there's some things where there'll be an element of judgment. There's some things where really these recommendations aren't advised. They're probably recommendations that would have to be followed. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to ask as well, despite the improvements since 2020, what gaps you still see we have in this area?
Specifically, if we were to respond to a pandemic.
To a crisis, yeah.
or a crisis.
Unforeseen, probably unforeseen crisis, yeah.
In my time, those events that have qualified as a crisis, therefore they've triggered our crisis management, or they've triggered these forums, I would say that it's been one of my pleasant surprises of government, how well the government performs in crisis situations, and how these functions, some of which I think were relatively new after the pandemic, have matured to the point that there's a very good operating rhythm in government. I would say that if I may, I think government's arguably better in a crisis than it is in peacetime. And
But
I
what
think that's true of
gaps
the
do you
Jersey
still
government.
see?
So gaps at the moment, I don't see any obvious ones. We're obviously still at the tail end of this major coordinated with the UK scenario exercise we went through over the winter months. There'll be some learnings. There'll be some learnings from that, I'd imagine. But I don't see anything that worries me at all, even on the financial side of how you'd quickly unlock money to deal with a situation that's been resolved as a learning from the pandemic. So I don't. This is our ability to respond to a crisis is not one of the things that would keep me awake at night.
Thank you for that. I mean, clearly what you've just articulated there is that there are some merits to the fact that there was a pandemic framework in place, for example.
Precisely.
And then I suppose what follows from that is clearly whether or not, in your view, that merit can be applied to adopting that in other areas of governance. And what you've just alluded to there is that there is the Jersey Resilience Framework.
Yeah.
Could you just give us some sense of, from your perspective, how do you intend to take that forward, and what do you think government needs to prioritise within that framework in order to actually make it as effective as it possibly can be?
Yeah, I think we've now arrived at what I think is probably the best structure for us. I think it works well, and I think most of its standing members believe that it works well. Obviously, not obviously, following this pandemic, following the UK-led exercise that we and other places have participated in, I imagine that we'll have some learnings that lead us to update the strategic framework and represent it to the Resilience Forum and to here and other places. But I think I would relate it to a risk register, and our biggest risks on that risk register that we think will require this level and intensity of crisis management. So those would typically be some of our biggest risks on the risk register. Not necessarily some of our economic ones, but certainly those ones which are going to impact civil society. We've already, to give you an example of that, had to consider the issue of nuclear risks in contiguous places to Jersey. We've done that jointly with Guernsey. We've done that. I think doing it jointly with Guernsey helped us both deal well with the French nuclear emergency team and understand how they see those scenarios. So I think that's one of those very high impact, hopefully low probability risks, like the pandemic itself before it happened, where you would use the Resiliency Forum. And I think part of the job of the Resiliency Forum is to keep revisiting the risk register to look for those opportunities where we do need to do that level of planning. It's also the job of the Chief Risk Officer in the government, as well as all the chief officers. The way that our risk register work is we are the first line of defence. It's our job to call out when we see something that could have that level of impact.
Could I just pick you up on something that you said earlier on in terms of, there's hundreds of recommendations. What is it about the work, for example, that you're doing around the resilience framework and the recommendations that may come out of that work with the UK that you would pay more attention to than perhaps maybe some of the recommendations that have been put in the past? I think my question is about how do you prioritise the importance of recommendations when they're presented to you?
Yes, I mean, and again, I need to be humble here because the prioritisation of the 100 has effectively been done by other people before I arrived in the scene, and you'll get a much fuller answer from Kate Bride, for example, who's worked through all of them. I think the first thing to say is, and this is a general issue, that this is a theme you've heard me touch on before in much less serious matters. I think Jersey encourages and invites a level of scrutiny that leads to hundreds of recommendations, rather than trying to create a framework and approach, a commissioning approach or a scrutiny approach that says, give me your 5 best ones.
So
give me the 5 top ones.
How would you
Oh,
do
there's
that
tried and
differently?
tested techniques. Same techniques we use to
give
get the
us an
CSP
example.
from 40 things to 10 things.
Give us an example of
so
that, if you
then
can.
you would run a risk. In that case, if you had 100 things that people thought you ought to do, you would run a risk workshop and a prioritisation workshop, where you would work with all the people, in this case, the Resiliency Forum and some of the SMEs who support that. You would work with them to rank and prioritise and pyramid down. You would work to figure out, does one action actually unlock 3 others? So you would rank, you would look for codependencies, you'd look for things that would maybe, if you hit one switch, 3 things would happen rather than one switch. So that's a whole discipline.
Sorry to stop you, but just because I think we're talking in theoretical concepts, I'm just trying to actually try and establish from yourself, based on what you now know and based on your experience of actually managing the government through some of these serious incidents that you've talked about, what do you believe is your direction, which is your approach to actually making sure that the government is in the best place to respond to recommendations that will actually deliver the kind of outputs and outcomes that are sought through various reviews, various learning that has been done through previous pandemics, previous serious incidents? How do you approach that?
I think the first thing to say is, and again, I can't look back because I wasn't there, if you have invested in a lot of infrastructure, if you've spent £360 million responding to a pandemic, if we're just talking about the pandemic, if you've created new functions or if you've expanded the budgets and invested in new functions, one would rather hope that those functions, that you wouldn't have to take on 100 recommendations in future. One would hope that those functions themselves can prioritise and can identify the biggest things because they're part of government now that for public service. So I think that's the first thing. I think you would want to lean on what you'd invested in.
And do you believe that investment is the right investment now in your assessment?
Right for what?
For any future pandemic that might come or any...
Well, of course, we're testing that at the moment, but certainly, as I said, I was pleasantly surprised about how much infrastructure around risk and resilience had either been created or upgraded post the pandemic. One would always have areas where one thinks one can do more, but I think in those areas, I think, without wishing to prejudge the final review of the exercise we've just done, I think we're in pretty good shape as a jurisdiction. So I don't have big holes that I'm trying to plug. I think all I was trying to do is say to you is that I think it's very important if you commission advice, that in the commissioning and advice, you're an intelligent purchaser of that information, of that consultancy. Yeah. And I feel it's in Jersey's makeup to almost be in a situation of have people tell them everything they think that they could possibly do in a very aspirational, non-prioritised way. We've got a habit of setting international panels up, international advisory groups, very aspirational. It's a feature of our politics, which I'm sure we'll come on to. Very aspirational, non-prioritised and very additive. And it's been a big feature of my time here to try and get you all to think in a more prioritised way.
I will take you back, unfortunately. I've been here during the pandemic.
Yes, I was here, but not in government.
I mean, I was in the States. And when we're talking about Hunter's recommendation, I think we need to put it in the context that some of the recommendations were done by independent inquiry, looking into the pandemic. Some recommendations were done on specific topics by Controller and Auditor General. And some recommendations were done during the pandemic because we needed to address situations like travel or health or as we went through the pandemic. So in my view, because the recommendations came in different time and we are looking back now, it was the job of the government as recommendation came in, actually said, somebody else put this recommendation because I cannot influence recommendation as a states members. We cannot influence recommendation of independent inquiry, and we will never influence recommendation of the CNEG. My question, this is why I tried to make up the story that was behind the recommendations, how we came to 100, and this is why we are trying to say. When you came to this post, and it was 2.5 years ago, and I assume, as we talked about, the emergency situation, unforeseen situation pandemic was on top of on your mind, because how we're prepared, how we're resilient. When you looked at all these recommendations, what exercise you and your team did, said this is duplications, this is fine, but this is what we need to address? So what you put as a priority for yourselves 2.5 years ago to increase resilience of Jersey, and what changed? And what is outstanding?
Yeah, so the infrastructure to work through those recommendations had already been set up by my predecessor, and a number of chief officers who were here before, during and after the crisis were already well advanced with that work. My view on that side of things, and I'd done the same thing leading a major organisation in Jersey myself, because everyone, of course, had to learn from the pandemic. My view when I came in, when I looked at it, was that the officers were well advanced with the situation. Evolution into the JER and into the Jersey Resilience Forum from the Community Risk Register was well advanced. And actually, the best thing to do with them and to help them was to complete work which was already well advanced, not to come in and confuse everyone. So I can't claim to have been there at the start of this when they might have prioritised differently. They've worked their way through it, and they've risk assessed their way through it, and there's been good governance around that. I guess what I'm saying is, the question you asked me was about the future. In the future, I would like to think that we don't find ourselves in a similar position. Because if you think about the pandemic, how distinctive were our learnings from the learnings of the other bigger countries that had full pandemic studies done? I don't think ours were particularly distinctive beyond the things that would happen in a small island. So I think in these areas, because we've invested, we should have less to do in response to the next one. We should be better prepared for the next one, but we'll definitely have learnings. If we're in a situation again where 5 different bodies want to give us recommendations, I would look to one body to say, can you summarise and prioritise that?
Sorry, I would like to get back to my question. My question was, what your priorities, if you can mention 3, from coming to the work, and what outstanding from your perspective?
On the pandemic, or on the general issue of resiliency?
Pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and preparedness for the next pandemic or any other unforeseen crises that Jersey might face.
Well, in terms of the areas that I've mentioned, the infrastructure, the leadership coordination, etc., I don't have anything which I'm looking at as that's not yet been done, that needs to be done. We're actually in a different phase where we think we've addressed the issues to a significant extent, and they've now been tested in a pandemic scenario exercise through this winter. And the feedback on that, I think, will inform our next set of actions. Yeah. How ready we are. The area that, so that's on the pandemic. In general, on the whole risk and resiliency issue, I may have said this before, I think we've learned a lot of the lessons. One of my concerns is still around risk appetite. So one of the things I think that the public service and the Council of Ministers, and frankly the Assembly, finds difficult is the articulation of risk appetite. Are we clear about how much risk we're willing to accept ahead of time and why we're willing to accept it? And I think if we can have a more higher level of maturity on articulating our risk appetite, I think that's the final thing that will really help us be prepared for any event. That doesn't just apply to the pandemic.
You've got enough finances in place then for that sort of thing?
For risk appetite? Well, this is why I want to have it. It's a great question, Glenn, because it's my experience, and it's a feature of Jersey politics in my view, it's one of my reflections, is because Jersey politics is additive and aspirational, because Jersey's politicians tend to use what we would call the hard levers of government, not the soft levers of government. I think our aspiration leads us to adopt standards, usually from other places, risk standards, which always look good because they're usually best in class. But I think they, in practice, take us beyond our actual risk appetite, because we then have to put the money up to pay for the risk standards. We find ourselves getting bogged down in machinations about it's too much money, it's too little money, this, that, and the next thing. Or we get bogged down in discussions that say that's really disproportionate for Jersey.
Just
and if
on
it's
that-
disproportionate, why did you adopt it?
Sure. Well,
You know,
just
so I
on
think
that
we need a
issue-
more mature risk appetite discussion.
Sorry, MJ, just on that issue of money, what do you believe the government needs to spend to prioritise, to address the priorities in
On the pandemic or in general?
On a pandemic.
I think they're done. You know, I think they've done for that. They've put a mechanism in to access 100 million rapidly if there's another pandemic. So they've learned that lesson as well. So I don't see. I mean, in areas like health, one can spend till the cows come home. That's the challenge with health, isn't it? But I don't think we are underinvested, if that's your question on that. My worry more is that we sometimes adopt standards without thinking through what it means in practice to meet them.
Can I make that?
Not related to the pandemic, but related to other
Other
things.
things, okay. So, because what I want to do is just try and bring that point and connect it to the overall issue around financial resilience. And I mean, for the benefit of the public, first of all, do you know how much was spent on
Yes, 360 million.
360 million?
By far the biggest part of that was the COVID payroll scheme was 128 million. So
And have we set aside the same amount in the event that there would be a pandemic tomorrow?
no, as I understand it, what we've done is ensure that in the first instance, money can be deployed rapidly in the event of a future pandemic so that it can be released quickly. Obviously, that's one of the learnings and one of the recommendations was how you got up and running quickly. So, and Seb will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's 100 million that would be released in all likelihood from borrowing or the strategic reserve.
So given the position around the stabilisation fund and the strategic reserve at the moment, do you think that that financial resilience is there, or are there other solutions or other options? Why do you think that?
You mean the 100 million?
Yes.
So, I mean, you know my view on the public finances. We've discussed that separately. You know my view that the aspirational, non-prioritised nature of Jersey politics has led us to a position where things that really need funded sometimes don't get it, and things that I would regard as discretionary do get money, but that's politics. In this instance, the strategic reserve is more than able to cope with that kind of call. The borrowing capacity of government is more than able to cope with that. The stabilisation fund isn't, because it's depleted.
How does that?
And
Can I just ask
I would like the stabilisation fund to be restored, as you know, we've discussed it, and that would be an obvious immediate port of call in a future pandemic. It wouldn't cover the whole amount. You wouldn't necessarily have 100 in the stabilisation fund, but that would cover the most immediate needs. I think we should say, however, that it's unlikely that the next bill would be 360, because if you look at what we spent on, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we spent money on things that we might not have. We built a hospital that we never used, for example. So you'd like to think that the bill would be different, and I think that's one of the reasons why in learning the lessons, the recommendation isn't that you try and set aside or access exactly what you spent before, but a reasonable sum. Sorry, Deputy
that
Corbett.
was actually my question related to. Was that the 360 the initial budget, or what other unexpected expenditure was related to that? And how would you ensure value for money on urgent decision-making situations?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure there's been a full political debate on this, but I think when you spend 360 million quickly, by government standards, you're not always going to spend it well. So I think there's some lessons to be learned about what things worked well and had an impact, and what things, with the benefit of hindsight, were good ideas that wouldn't work well at all. I mean, to give you an example, test and track and tracing, we spent 76 on, I think, in the UK. I think it's realised after the event that not all of that money was spent as well as it could be. But this is where we have to be humble. You're now going back in history and judging people who were making decisions in a very difficult situation, in a crisis. Things which had a powerful impact cost very little were vaccines. The total bill for vaccines is £10 million. That feels like value for money after the fact, doesn't it? So I think we learn lessons. Areas that I would poke around in from lessons learned are definitely the economic measures. We spent 128 on the payroll scheme. We spent another 30 on various economic recovery type schemes. You'll have heard from the Treasurer or from the Treasury Minister that they're struggling to get some of that money back that was lent out to people in the pandemic. So there's areas like that, I think, where you would look at things. Other areas you'd think, cheapers, I would happily spend that money again if it took the edge off a pandemic.
Are there any other areas of financial risk that you've uncovered in your assessment of the learning from the recent pandemic?
From the pandemic? No, not necessarily stemming from the pandemic. Obviously, in the 100 recommendations, there's about 30 or so that need to be embedded into health, public health, actual health department and emergency planning, and that's still in a stage of maturity. But there's nothing else from that period that jumps out at me. What I guess I'm more concerned about is my broader theme, that if you think about how much we spent on things like economic recovery and these things, which are schemes to get people through, I still think we've got areas, and I've mentioned it before, like fire, like ambulance, where we've not fully funded our current risk appetite. Mm-hmm. We've set a risk appetite for those services. Sorry, we've adopted risk standards for those services, which form a risk based on our risk appetite, but we haven't been able to get those fully into government budgets. Not just this government, this has been going on for years. Mm-hmm. We're able to fully fund the police, in my view, but we, for whatever reason, find it harder with the other blue lights. And I think if you're thinking about it in the context of the pandemic, the other blue lights can play a crucial role. And I still feel that it'd be better to fund the blue lights and public safety than to come up with various schemes to support the economy in the short run.
Thank you for that. As the Principal Accountable Officer, what are the ways do you think that government can build the financial resilience past reliance on reserves?
Oh, this is a general question. It's not related to the...
It has some connection to it generally in terms of the issue around risk appetite, but more about how do you build that resilience around your reserve position?
I think obviously one of the things I'm going to have to say is prioritisation. I do think that a budget of 1.35 billion, which has grown by 650 in about 8 years, there's serious questions to be asked there. So I think in prioritising, one of the ways we could improve our resilience is to spend less. I think the level we're spending at, according to the chief economist, is inflationary in its own right. I think one way is to spend less. The other one, and we're getting into bigger issues that we can come back to in the end, is we do need to look at the other end of it and think, can we grow areas of our economy that are going to pay tax? So can we get the revenue in? And I think we've recognised that in the case of our international financial centre, we do really need to set that back on a path of undeniable growth, or at least do everything we can to help it grow. And I'm not sure that we've got a strategy for economic growth for the rest of the economy. So those are things that I would look at. In the reserves themselves, and they're independently run, so it's not for me, but I think you would look again at our risk appetite in some of our reserves, our investment risk appetite. What level of returns do we really think that we need to try and achieve? So I think you'd review those areas. I think the next government would review those areas. To be fair to the Treasurer, I think she said that she is reviewing reserves, so she may have that in hand. So these are some of the things I would look at.
No, I just wanted to ask as well if any additional investments or insurance strategies have been considered as well to go in that direction.
Yeah, there has been a lot of work in insurance. Part of some of it is in response to a couple of CNAG reports, I guess now. So obviously with things like the pandemic, some risks are uninsurable. So I think when you're talking about the biggest risks in the community risk register, they are effectively self-insured. And that's why we need a strategic reserve. That's why we need reserves, because we have to, there's things we can't insure for. But certainly there's been a look at insurance strategies in other areas. There's a whole debate about insurance, social insurance, actual insurance and health, which is about the sustainability of funding the health service, which the health team and the health ministers are looking at. But I think in answer to the Deputy Wilson's question, I would come at it from those three ends. I would say, can we spend less on what we regard as maybe less essential things and make sure the essentials are fully covered? Can we bring in more revenue by growing areas of the economy? I think in the case of the finance centre, the answer is probably yes. And do we need to look again at our investment strategy for our reserves? And I think that's one of the things that I'm sure the Treasurer will come back to. We also still have, obviously, shareholdings and things that we could sell if we needed to in various companies.
As an economist,
this doesn't feel like a compliment, but keep going.
No, it is. I mean, you're all known economist, so
it's actually trying to draw on your expertise, Andrew. Given what you've said about the economy, but how would you protect it against future shocks? What would your leadership contribution be to that? And if you can give some real sort of tangible sort of examples of the steps that you would take.
To protect the economy from shocks. Well, you know, look, you've got two types of shocks. You've got, in the terrible language of economists, you've got the exogenous shocks, things that happen to you, like waking up and finding that a country's at war and it somehow impacts you. And then you've got endogenous shocks, things that are actually coming from inside your own economy and impacting you. I think when it comes to exogenous shocks, I think the island's best protection against exogenous shocks is having big reserves. Having big reserves. And one of my themes is that, in my view, our reserves should be bigger than they are. Because when those reserves were, particularly the strategic reserve, was set up, the economy was about half the size it is just now. The economy's doubled, so it's a bigger thing you're trying to protect. And I would say, sadly, the world's become a scarier place. So not only is the thing you're trying to protect double the size it was, one might argue that the risks in the world are probably about double the size they were as well. So you put two things together, there's more risk of things happening to you which you can't control. So I think the number one thing is to have a much higher level of reserves to protect you against unforeseen
What are the
shocks.
consequences of that,
So
having high level reserves
having higher level of
on the
reserve,
public sector?
yeah,
finance?
having higher level of reserves, I think depends how you want to fund it. Okay, and you've got all the levers available to you in terms of, as we discussed before, you can take more risk in trying to make the reserves grow. You can tax more and put it straight into reserves if you think that you need to increase the size of your rainy day funds, or you can spend less on other things, which would be my recommendation, and put it into the reserves. I genuinely struggle to understand why the public service has to spend more than £1 billion to run in Jersey. And so that means to me there's a couple of 100 million which might be better going into reserves and then doing stuff when you have to. So I think building that resiliency, very important for the economy.
Just on that point, if I could press, which areas of the public service do you think that affects most in terms of trying to become more efficient in order to release that
Well,
reserve?
there's different ways that one would go about it, and it's ultimately a political decision. But I think in terms of impacts, I think we have to go back to basics in Jersey. What is government for? Shelter, health, education, if you're an island, connectivity, public safety. You start adding things onto that, you're starting to move into the discretionary space for a government.
Andrew,
We've moved way beyond those 5 things.
in your position, would you have expected being able to have more influence on actually putting those positions in and making that actually happen within that time frame you've been in office?
No, because I understand Jersey politics and the political system.
And still linked to protect
That's the job of the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister.
to protecting from future economic shocks. Which sectors you see as the most vulnerable, and how would you protect them, support them on that?
Well, we were talking about any big exogenous shocks, which is why I think you just need a lot of money. I mean, the thing that anyone who's going to lend to you or do business with you respects most is if you've got a big pile of cash sat on the side for rainy days. It lowers the cost of everything else you're trying to do. So I think that's important. I think you then drop down a level of resiliency in terms of economic shocks. If you look at, and I wasn't involved in it at all, the whole business of the ferries, but if you look at a lot of the rationale of the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development in the whole procurement ferry story, a big part of his thinking was about resilience, was trying to put in place a contract where he had knowingly was paying for and carrying significant excess lane capacity so that we were never ever going to be too tight, trying to get the number of ships, more ships into that service so that you weren't at the mercy of one ship going down. So there's a lot of resiliency work to try and protect against economic shocks that the departments will do, and that would be true of every department. The sectors that are most vulnerable to shocks, I mean, I'd have to have a think about it for sure. But I think, you know,
Like small
Jersey's a place which does better if people visit it. For example, it's a place that has to be visited, and anything that impacts people visiting Jersey impacts some sectors much more than others. So, I think that's one of the things you'd have to think about. There's a whole load of sectors who, we're 100,000 people, so you can't really see us as having a kind of autonomous growth engine. We don't have an autonomous ability to grow and sustain a big business economy. We really need people to visit. So you then think about it that way and you realise aspects of connectivity are very important. The costs associated with that are become, I think, very important to us. And I think one of the things that's, I mean, we probably take for granted in Jersey, but one of the things that's truly remarkable about Jersey is it's managed to grow this international finance centre. So, you know, it's growing something that's worth £4 billion. I mean, it's gigantic compared to anyone's wildest imaginations. And that definitely increases visitor traffic and other things. But I think alongside that, Jersey's always got to be distinctive as a place, and it's also always got to be a place that people want to visit. And I think we need to pay attention to all the resiliency risks and economic risks around that.
Can I just come back to the position of the International Finance Centre? I mean, clearly that brings a lot of benefits to the island, as you've just highlighted.
Yeah.
If the unthinkable were to happen, in terms of when you think of the geopolitical situation and that the strength of the International Finance Centre was tested, what kind of resilience do you think, as the Chief Executive, that you need to address? What would you do in that kind of a situation?
Well, let's enumerate the size of the problem.
Sure.
So it's 40% of GVA, but most people, GVA is unrelatable. Mm-hmm. It's 60% of tax. And I think that's based on direct. And if you started to do the normal economic multipliers, if I did a full economic analysis, that 60% number is going to go one way up. Mm-hmm. Because there are restaurants in the town that wouldn't survive if that centre wasn't there, obviously. So I think realistically, it's somewhere around 2/3 of our revenue is dependent on this, as I say, remarkable thing that we've somehow managed to built by Jersey men and women, it has to be said as well, a made in Jersey thing. So that's 66%. Really, one of the reasons that I have been very clear about the need to build the strategic reserve higher is this reason. If that industry was massively disrupted by any shocks, could be geopolitical, more likely to be multiple and converging threats, technology changing the nature of the industry, politicians elsewhere changing our licence to operate. It's already happened with Brexit, pretty serious for Jersey. It's happened with the funds legislation of the European Union. So if anything led to a sort of precipitous drop in activity in that sector, we would very quickly be probably leaning on our strategic reserves. But more importantly, we would have the poise and the time to restructure the economy if we had a big reserve. And I think that's why the strategic reserve is so important. If you didn't have a finance centre, the strategic reserve is probably the right size. The fact that you've got a finance centre and you've built public services up to a level that you couldn't have built them up to otherwise means you need that strategic reserve. And this is the thing that it vexes me with the finance centre, because, you know, no one loves to go banking. Finance is a hard thing to love, let's be honest about it. It's not like making cars or other stuff that people get very excited about. But the reality is that we have public services that we simply could not afford if we weren't drawing the tax from that sector. Mm-hmm. We would have an effective personal tax rate of 60% if we weren't having that sector. So we've kind of got to recognise that it does allow us to live our life in a way that might not otherwise have been possible. But we also then have to recognise that it could be subject to shocks, and we want to make sure that we've got enough reserves to cope with those shocks and to find our way through that situation. So that's my main concern about the reserves.
So in a sense, that's the basic foundation of a financial plan that you would put together to actually make sure that Jersey's resilience was as sound.
To be fair to you, in past governments, you know, one of the bodies you created was the Fiscal Policy Panel, they've effectively told you this in repeated reports. They've told you that your strategic reserve should probably be about 4 billion. They've told you this. Now, we can't change things quickly because if you think about it, we created the strategic reserve, I think, at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and we created it from the fact that interest rates were 15% and we were getting huge profits from the bank. We were getting huge revenues because the interest rates were 15%. We put it in, we've invested in it, it's just accumulated. We've never really gone back and actively kept putting it in. So if you think about your own personal finances, that's like putting a lump sum into pension and then not putting any more in. Most people each month would say, I'll keep putting a little bit in, trying to get the thing to grow over time. And I think Jersey would be well advised getting back into the savings habit of saying, going forward, we're not going to double the reserve in one government. The money's not there.
No.
But we should have the discipline to say, let's just make sure every year we stick 50 million or whatever the number is, doesn't matter, into that thing, into the rainy day fund, and then hopefully we never have to use it. But if we do, try and get it up to the sort of size that would be required.
Okay. I'm just going to come back onto, thank you for that. I'm going to move us on to the emergencies or contingency law, if I might. So the CAG has previously made some recommendations that consideration should be given to the respective roles of the Council of Ministers and Emergencies Council in circumstances where a state of emergency has not been declared. Could you tell us, have such roles been updated?
Now, have I lost myself here?
Page 6.
We're jumping about. We're jumping.
Page before, I think.
Page before, is it? I mean, they have been updated, is the good news. But
Good.
this is something which, again, my colleague, I should pay tribute to her, Kate Bryden, has been anchoring this for some time. So we're pretty much in the pre-drafting and preparation phase for this. It's something that I imagine will be prioritised near the start of the term for the next government, because it's going to be ready for the next government if they choose to prioritise it in their CSP.
Why
So-
has it not been prioritised in this term?
I don't know. I think it's partly the sort of disruption we had. We've had two governments for the price of one, haven't we, in this 4 years? So I think we had a situation where I think we kind of lost 6 months between the tail end of one government ultimately falling over and another lot coming in, and with different agendas and so on and so forth. So, and again, I think it's one of those things which, when push came to shove, didn't get into the top 10. Now, they might say it didn't get into the top 10 because actually it's a fairly complicated thing. There's been a lot of briefing on it and so on and so forth. But I think it's at the point, to answer your question now, where it's almost good to go. The law drafting time will be devoted to it. The law drafting time has been prioritised to the CSP, which we've discussed before. So I think it's good and ready to go. Where I would part company with some people is that the absence of that law in itself, I want to reassure you, doesn't mean to say we're running a huge risk, because a lot of the things that we've just discussed that have happened are addressing the real risks, having
Yes.
But it would still, I think, be the completion, if you like, for a lot of colleagues who've been working on this area since the pandemic. It would be kind of the completion of that phase of the work to get this on the statute book.
Just point of clarification, no, it's helpful to understand the situation. So how the role of the Council of Ministers and Emergency Council were updated
Are there specific
if the
examples?
state of emergency has not been declared? So they needed to be updated. Where they are now, are they different, or we need the law to update them?
Well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've only got the experience of what they've been since I've been in, so I can't do a compare and contrast with how they were before.
I think what we're looking for is the law is, as you say, it's almost ready to go. And
The law does
to test
clarify
whether or
these
not
rules, but
those
it's not on
roles-
the statute book.
Right.
It's not in the statute book. What I'm saying is de facto, I feel that a lot of the things you would expect to happen are happening in practice, but they're not in the statute book because they're in the law.
Okay. Can you confirm for us that those roles and responsibilities are actually reflected
Yes,
and
I
updated?
can
That
can
would be
confirm that in
helpful.
writing. And many other things, COM, Emergency Council, resilience standards, there's a lot of stuff that's clarified in there. It just needs to be prioritised now for the statute book.
Yeah. One of the questions we do have is around the recommendations that were related to the contingency law. And given that it hasn't been approved yet, but some of the recommendations were closed before the legislation's been presented, can you just give us an explanation as to why that is the case?
Can you give me an example of one? If they've been closed, it's because we'll think that they're operational.
I think this is probably a situation that I discussed with PAC, probably in the private hearing we had recently around the demonstration with Evolve, and there's a bit of a philosophical, I think, discussion around when to close a recommendation. So I think what the officers probably expect in those specific situations, although without the examples to hand, is that the work has been done and the law has not been necessarily been passed, but it's in that queue for the legislative programme and prioritised in line with whatever the council of ministers take for the next for the next government.
If one of those recommendations was to update roles and responsibilities, yet we haven't got the legislation in place yet, was the assurance that they have been?
I think the difficulty is that what we're trying to do with all the information and the recommendations that we track and monitor is that we try and make sure that we've got a reasonably good oversight of what we've got and what we've got in train. And that means sometimes that if we kept everything open to the point at which it would gone through the legislative process that we know is not always a quick one, you'd quite quickly lose that oversight. And I think that's a piece of work that we've been trying to do for quite some time in line with Andrew's comments, etc., around prioritisation, in trying to get a really clear portfolio of what we're working on and what we're reporting on.
I think that it's to do with really trying to assure the public that what was recommended has been acted upon and it's actually happened.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. I think it's been recommended and acted upon, and where it's been recommended acted upon, it will be closed. That doesn't mean say it's on the statute book and in the law. So, for example, the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister are under no illusions about what's in the law and what it means for their roles and the clarity of their roles. We've had those discussions, we've had those forums, they've been taken through it in detail by the Chief Officer, by other officers, and in some cases the work is ready to go onto the statute book, but it's not on the statute book. So I misunderstood your question.
Is it any way that maybe we need to consider to have recommendations that you have a category pending legislation approval? Because where is my worry come, and I will share that we do have a change of government or change the corporate, but we are talking about the corporate memory. We can have change in offices. And if officers done all the work and it's only waiting for the legislative approval, it can sit on this special category that any new Council of Ministers or any new officers coming in, it's there, and until it's passed the legislation and it has a statutory, it can be closed. But otherwise, you closed, it's not on any tracker, and it can be lost in transition.
And on this aspect as well, are any underlying risks solved by other means in the waiting of a legislation, and how do you monitor the closed recommendations?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How do you monitor the closed recommendations in that way? And while waiting
de
for a
facto
legislation,
happens?
is
Yeah.
any like the underlying risk is solved by other means in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, I realise now this is a very specialist area of what's in the tracker and what's not. I think one thing to think about recommendations in future is as I said before, there's 7 ways that a minister can change things, really. They can tax, they can spend, they can regulate, they can legislate. Those are the hard levers, the ones that I believe we're using too much in Jersey. And then they can convene, they can communicate, and they can provide oversight. Those are the soft levers. I think when we're thinking about recommendations, if our recommendations are hard levers, they're going to take longer and be harder to do, because so if you have a recommendation that requires law to be made, I think you're going to have to be patient versus a recommendation that says, I would like you to introduce a new oversight power for the minister to ensure this happens. Does that make sense? And I think one of my concerns about Jersey and its current politics and political system is the preponderance of hard levers and the underuse of soft levers by ministers and assistant ministers. And I think if there's one thing that you try and change quickly, it would be to try and get people to be better with the soft powers and not be drawn to the hard powers, because people seem to come into office wanting to either tax, spend, legislate or regulate. They don't seem to come into office wanting to convene and discuss and to shape things without using those hard levers. And I think a lot of, if Kate Brown were here, she'd say a lot of the things that you want to see happen in that law are actually happening now in practice. They probably don't need the law, but we are where we are with the law. And it's certainly true for the Council of Ministers and the Chief Minister. I think it was a fairly notifiable event when we took them through the draft law and said, this is how it's going to be, and this is what it means going forward. So they're being well briefed on it, even if it isn't in their CSP, and hopefully it'll go in the statute book next.
That raises all sorts of questions around government's relationship with the public in terms of openness and transparency about what it's doing and what it's achieving.
Yes, but we've discussed this before. I think when you have such a low turnout, it's an enormous leap of faith to say that who votes represents the public.
Let's get back to the recommendation. Let's get back to the
I think
recommendation.
strictly on recommendation point of view, what I think us and the public would want to see when something is closed is not to just say that it's closed with the intention of doing something. It's closed with the instruction of that to be done and action has started, even if it's taking longer.
Yeah.
In that sense. Yeah.
I would like to pick up recommendations around COVID-19 procurement in general as a bulk, because when we discuss with Deputy Wilson value for money and where we spend gone, obviously we said there is lots of political decisions were made. And I looked through this Controller and Auditor General recommendations, and most of the Controller and General recommendations were around what officers can do. And I'll pick up one of them. It's a report on procurement. Can we be reassured that every recommendations that were there to ensure that value for money, and we know there is in quick purchases can be fraud, but to ensure that in the next pandemic, the money will be spent better, we had these 8 recommendations of procurement. Were they all implemented?
I'm going to have to write you on that because I'm not sure I know the procurement recommendations in enough detail.
But procurement recommendation, it's around financial management, it's around the breaches, it's about how supply reviews for quality and quantity, ensure exemption and breach documented across. There is lots of things in procurement.
Those just sound like
purchases.
mother and apple pie stuff you'd say for any procurement. I mean, is it specific to the pandemic or is
It
this
was
just...
specific around the pandemic, how you make decision in procurement in emergency situations.
I mean,
I think, Andrew, if I might, I think some of the issues are concerned with the appropriate procurement of PPP,
okay.
vaccines, workforce, because, there was also the procurement of local
Nightingale.
staff and then the hospital procurement process as well.
I need to write to you on those. I mean, obviously, again, we've got an approach to procurement. It's not obvious to me that, and this would be true for all governments because everyone's had trouble, it's not obvious to me that in a future pandemic, one would be as frenetic in one's procurement as we are this time, because obviously one of the lessons we've learned is the need for certain risks to be covered in advance. But why don't I write you on...
You're right back about the
on that
part,
issue,
and this
'cause I'm
because
not-
there's 8 recommendations specific on procurement, and this is okay. Back to Deputy Wilson.
Okay, so finally for me, if I can come to the, and thank you for your answers so far, the current geopolitical uncertainties and the importance of food security, energy resilience and the island's transport links. What steps, if any, has government taken to strengthen Jersey's preparedness for unforeseen events like this, including disruption to supply chains and the potential impact upon essential food, fuel and medical supplies?
Yeah, so those are very much rooted in the ministries of the particular minister, whether it be food and obviously in Jersey's case highly related to transport is in the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development, fuel, infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, health, etc. So all of those, as I said at the start, one of the things I've been impressed with coming in fresh to government after the pandemic and before some of the other, after the pandemic, after Haut-de-Mont, but before Storm Ciarán and these other things, is how much the need for resiliency features in the consideration of policy making. I get the impression that it's kind of moved up the pop chart significantly, and it's now very much been built into decision making in a way that maybe it wasn't to quite the same extent as before. So I think in all of those areas, very good work's underway. Sometimes building in resiliency into contracts and things is not sometimes, it is more expensive. But I think you've seen, for example, in the way that if we stick with the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development, I think whatever you think about what happened to the collapse of an airline, I think one has to recognise that the resiliency plan there kicked in very quickly, and that you had an alternative supply in a matter of days, up and running and so forth. I think you saw it in the ferry contract as well, the approach that we've been taking. I think if you look closely at where we are in things like electricity and how we approach resiliency in electricity, particularly in the use of some of our interconnectors, you will see that this is something now that is very much part of the way that we do business.
So those responses were in response to crises. Did you have plans in place to cover that kind of scenario? And were those plans fully resourced and costed so that you were able to mobilise them?
Yeah, so again, I'll try and speak from something that's happened while I've been here and not talk about other things. So in the case of the potential for a vital airline and air routes, an airline running vital routes ceasing to trade for whatever reason, that was a carefully planned for and well thought through resiliency plan. And there was a whole process there around that resiliency from the point of view of, I would imagine at a very early stage, government recognising the potential vulnerabilities in that supplier, understanding all of the impacts from that, and then doing careful work to understand the options available to the government to resolve that for the long haul, but also how to deal with the immediate situation if an airline stops flying. So that's an example that I've been able to see live, as it were, from my perspective, see it become escalated from out of the department when it was sufficiently concerned, see the original planning, see the resourcing, and see how it built confidence in the government that they'd be able to handle that event. So, as I said right at the top, I think that's been pretty impressive. I think similar thinking has therefore informed the ferry contract. I know that the government and the minister continue to attract a lot of heat from various quarters about that contract. But if you look carefully at that contract, it has a lot of resiliency built into it, and resiliency is at the forefront, was obviously at the forefront of the teams. I can take no credit from it because I was actually conflicted in that and didn't have anything to do with it. But with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that he's built significant contingency in from a resiliency perspective.
Sure. How does that resilience then, the learning from that, translate to other government departments? And where do you see the gaps in the resilience in other departments that need to be filled?
This issue of resiliency is part of this whole approach which we take. The Chief Risk Officer comes quarterly to the ELT, goes through the risk register, goes through the horizon risks. Before he comes to the ELT, or that team come to the ELT, they've already gone round the departments at departmental level looking at the same things. What should be escalated? What might the rating be changed of? What's emerging? So we would expect the risk to come up in this way through the risk forum. And all we're deciding there is this something you can handle yourself? Is this something in your departmental risk register? So in health, for example, the challenges that we have and had in the last winter with the flu, for example, and other respiratory illnesses at a peak time for the hospital, that's something they can handle themselves. Something else might come up where they say, look, we can't handle this self. Other departments will have to lean in, or we're going to have to do something to change demand or admissions. So that's how it works in practice. To get your question of, is there one that I'm particularly worried about that we haven't resolved? Not one that's critical. I'm obviously worried about economic growth, therefore I'm worried about the competitiveness of the finance centre, but we've got time to fix that. I am, as I said before, concerned that in a couple of areas, I feel that we have signed up to risk standards that we haven't yet been able to fully fund, but we'll come back to that.
I think that we're
it's
talking
critical.
about the economy, but for me, if I'm looking at contingency, have, as an executive, you completed testing of these contingency arrangements?
Well, yes, we're just an airline.
Not airline. For example, we have completely cut. We cannot get a food supply for a week. How Ireland would cope?
Yeah, so we've obviously done the exercise I mentioned with the UK government, which was a pretty full exercise. What we haven't done, unless correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think we've done one where we don't get supplies of food for an extended period.
That's an important one. That's an important one.
That is an important one if you think it's your highest risk. You have to, you know, this is the important thing about risk scenarios. You have to come up with credible scenarios if you're going to commit to a full government test on them. And
I mean, with the current geopolitical situation, the scenarios emerge very quickly.
But we already had, and
we?
these are things you should ask the department and the minister. But we already have very specific strategy for the storage of food capacity, the amount of food that we keep on the island, the amount of food we can access via different routes. There's already a full strategy for food, which predated the pandemic.
But what we're trying to say, have you recently run the testing of our island
the most recent contingency test that we ran live, obviously we had airlines, was a pandemic style scenario which we did in concert with the UK government this winter.
Another question, you mentioned food, electricity, like the major things which are important for the island. For example, electricity supply. On which risk register? Is it government corporate risk register or it's specific risk register?
I'll have to double check with you on it, it's certainly on there, but again, it's one thing, but on the risk register, the most important thing is the rating, you know, because things can have a very high, obviously, if we know electricity, they have a very high impact.
Yeah,
But how
across the island.
But how likely is it to happen? I think we know the likelihood of that is low. So we would tend not to devote huge contingency resource to something that's got a low likelihood of happening. What we would do is investigate and be sure about the resiliency of supply, particularly if you're talking about that case, in concert with the utility that deals with that. And if you look at that utilities investment programme, if you look at what it's doing over the next number of years, you can see that significantly they're investing in things which we think will either boost, enhance or preserve our resiliency. You know, they're investing in a new interconnector to
But
France.
that can
they're
be
investing in
contingency
online.
Yes,
But
Glenn,
it's-
sorry,
sorry,
sorry.
Glenn.
Yeah, I think we're just moving on from those particular things, and I think it's going to be a bit more of a reflection on your service that you've provided. Looking back over your service, which areas of delivering policy would you have liked to have seen departments make more progress on?
Well, the policy agenda, as it were, that during my time, that's obviously the most focus has been the CSP of the second of the governments, because I was only with the first of the governments for a couple of months. I think in that area, the area where I would like to have seen, well, it's important, let's take a step back. In my role, which is, you know, is attracting propositions by the day, but in my role, I am the groundsman. I'm not the player. The player is the minister. The players are the council of
But
ministers.
isn't as like you say, it's the
So
groundsman.
I don't have my own agenda, as it were. What I can do is help them shape their agenda and then help them deliver that agenda.
I think
So-
that goes back to a question I asked you before, Andrews, about in your position that you currently have as groundsman, as you state, you don't seem to have any influence over what the ministers finally do. That seems to have been missing in those policies then, is it? Is that something you feel as groundsman that you're not really listened to?
No, I mean, it's the nature of Jersey politics, which there's not many things left that are distinctive in Jersey, but its politics certainly are. The trade-off between accountability and efficiency, in the sense that the CNAG means, in the full sense of that word, in Jersey is political system means that absolutely the Council of Ministers is the decision-making body. No question about that. This is not a civil service-led government. This is very much Council of Ministers. Every penny that's in that budget, everything that's on that statute book has come from the Council of Ministers. So when you talk about the head of the civil service, all they're doing is helping that Council of Ministers put on the statute book what they want to put in the statute book.
Is there any big opportunities then that the government have got before the end of your term?
Well, I mean, in my view, I hope that they retain discipline. It's getting very late in the term. They put up a CSP. They've made fantastic progress in delivering that CSP. There's amendments coming through now on things that weren't in the CSP, which, you know, involve money, involve time. So I hope they stay disciplined. There's still much more work to be done to launch and get, I think, public support for the new strategy for financial services competitiveness. So I think that's a really important piece of work. And I still think we can hopefully sustain the momentum on curbing growth, which, you know, as I said before, has yielded about 60 million of savings so far. By the end of this year, should be about 100 million. which is 5p in income tax. So I think that's a big prize to go after. So I think the main thing now, this late in the term, Glenn, is maintaining discipline, finishing the job.
Is there obviously, there's going to be a significant amount of time from the Council of Ministers being re-elected. Have you got any examples of what prioritising you're doing for yourself within your role within the period and for the public service?
Well, you mean during Purda or just until
Yeah.
until they get up and running? I mean, I think for sure that there's ongoing statutory responsibilities. One of the things I will and have been clarifying with the Council of Ministers and with the Chief Minister is things that we feel that we can continue to work on during Purda under the, I guess, the why wouldn't you approach, or things that they believe actually should stop and be left until the next government comes in. So, and that would relate in particular to those objectives of mine around curbing growth, those objectives around succession planning, and those are objectives around the FS competitiveness review. So I want to try and establish with each of those ministers, but with the Council of Ministers, these are things that we believe we can reasonably get on with. Is everyone comfortable that we can reasonably get on with them? So we've established that clarity for curbing the growth. The Minister for External Relations, I believe, is going to write to me about the FS competitiveness one. And I think for succession planning with the SAB, we've established that clarity. These are things we're happy you get on with. These are things that we don't want you to get on with, but be ready to brief the new government.
So do you feel you're making a good, smooth transaction for the next
Yes,
government?
so we're doing that. That's the continuation work. The second thing is we have been refreshing the changeover plan. I thought we had a very good changeover plan for this government, albeit it came in unusual circumstances. The previous government made representations to me that they didn't feel that they had a brilliant induction in whenever that was, 2022. So we're taking all of those lessons and we're trying to make sure that we're even better this time. So the changeover plan's a piece of work that we're getting on with, getting ready to induct the new ministers. As I mentioned, reaching agreement on the objectives. And then the final thing that I'm hoping is the case is that there's a bit more time for continuing some of our leadership developing and coaching work.
Okay, and for the new ministers that are coming in, what would be your first bit of advice before you actually walk out the door? And I suppose the same question would go to your successor. What would you do?
Oh, you mean to, what would I say to, you mean, what would my advice be to the Council of Ministers or to me?
Yeah, obviously there's going to be a lot of new faces that are going to join.
Well, that's, you might know more than me about
I think
that.
nobody
I mean,
knows.
yeah, exactly, nobody knows.
Nobody
is the
knows,
answer.
but
But for sure it will be new Council of Ministers.
What would I say to the new Council of Ministers? Well,
So how will you communicate risks and opportunities, basically?
well, I think that the first thing to say is that I think if you're coming in as a new minister, a June election is spectacularly unhelpful because by my reckoning, by the time you get in, get your team together, you've got about 3 weeks of effective work before the holiday season blitzes in to try and put together a programme of government, and then you'll find yourself being scrutinised for 10 weeks when you come back your holidays till Christmas. I mean, I'm being facetious, but it's a serious point. Moving the elections to the summer hasn't done anything for turnout, according to the statisticians, but it's certainly impacted the operating rhythm of government. A new government comes in, faces this incredibly concertinaed period when everyone's trying to go on holiday and all that stuff. So I do think that my advice, if it's at all possible, would be have the serenity to accept the budget you've inherited, accept what you've inherited, and rather than rush quickly to create something to last you for 4 years, why don't you just put your foot in
Just
the
a minute,
ball
Glenn, have
and
it.
breathe out and spend the next 3 or 4 months really improving your strategic approach to government and then focusing on the 3.5 years to come. So that would be my main advice.
One
to my
question,
people.
if this is advice, and I
As
need
you-
to, no, if this is advice, which is fair enough, can you please give a bit more details? What would be would the future savings, which currently they identified in the budget that the next government must do, because we know that 2027, we have unidentified, I think 27 million savings, plus reopening conversations with the unions, because the agreement that this government put in place will finish in 2027.
Yes. next
So
year round.
it means that the next government, when they're coming in, they need to present the budget, which will start for 27, that currently we don't know how to save the money, and we know that the conversation with the unions will be reopened in 27. What advice you would be giving to the new Council of Ministers? Based on this, what to accept, what will be there on the plate?
So again, I think it's the same advice, which is to say, can you really, in 3 or 4 weeks, put together a vision for Jersey, which then informs a strategy for your government for 4 years, which then informs your priorities, your policies, everything? Is that possible when you've just spent 3 months probably campaigning hard to get elected? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I feel in those 3 or 4 weeks, unless by the invisible hand, all the people who come in and get ministerial positions have somehow managed to coordinate themselves, I think you leave yourself at the mercy of just picking up whatever's in the entry. And I just think it's so important that we break out of this cycle and that you come in and you give yourself the time to really be strategic, to have proper workshops, to really go into a bit more detail.
Does it mean that you would present to the new Council of Ministers and you will identify this 27 million savings
So
that currently are?
This happens to every government when it comes in. You're not describing a unique position. Everyone comes in mid-budget and they get what they get. On the 27 million, rest assured, whoever the Chief Minister is, I will tell him exactly in morning one, this is how I would deal with that, but it's up to you. Because it's
So you have
choices.
this presentation of this?
Absolutely. I will tell them on day one, that's how I would deal with it or allocate it, but it's up to you because, as I said to you, I'm the groundsman. I'm not the striker.
On this matter, so a new government comes in, what would you tell them is the most urgent issue to address, and what lessons should they prioritize?
Well, I mean, this is where you're asking the groundsman to be the striker again, or whatever
I'm sure he still played football at some point in his life.
Maitre d' to be the chef in case of I mean, one of the things that I would do definitely is, and I say do it, redo it, because I've done it with both now, is I do think this point about how our politics has developed is really important, which is we're spendthrift. We are addicted to the hard levers of government, literally addicted to them, and we don't use the soft levers of government. So I would be putting a lot of time into going back over that with the new team to say, you probably can get much more done than you think without recourse to taxing and spending and regulating. There's other ways you can get stuff done, and it's worth investing in them, because I genuinely don't think, I don't know about the voting public because it's so small, but the public, which is big, there's nothing in the feedback I get to suggest they like what we're doing. They feel stifled by regulation. They feel that we're overactive. They feel that we're doing too much, playing too big a role in their lives. They're giving us no feedback, as the Chief Minister keeps saying. People don't stop me in the street and say thank you. It just doesn't happen. So I think we've got to have some self-awareness and say, do we really need to go at this and start banging stuff on the statute book, bringing in new regulations, having endless debates about charges and taxes and spending, or can we just settle down and get more done in other ways? So that would be a big part of it, because, you know, genuinely, as, again, I'm the groundsman, it's for the Chief Minister to say it, but I do think the feedback that's coming back to us, if we really have got our ears open, is that we are playing, public service is playing too big a role in the life of islanders, is one of the things that's coming back to us. And in my job, that manifests itself as operational risk. Government takes on stuff that it probably doesn't have the budgets or the capacities to do really well,
Can you give an
and
example?
it turns into operational risk.
Can you give an examples just to public that listening?
Yeah,
that-
and I've said before, I'll give you an example, and I've said it before. Let's take the fire service. We've adopted effectively UK fire standards in all their shapes and forms. It's quite difficult for such a small fire service in such a small island to transpose UK generated standards into our small island environment. In order for them to do it, they therefore have to access resources, money, to put that in place. They find it difficult to get that money through successive government budgets, and that, you know, that they just do. As I've said before, the blue lights, police are always more likely to get money than the others. And I think that's just Jersey politics as far as I can see. But so when we sign up to these standards, some minister in the past has thought, yeah, the thing we must do is sign up to the UK standards. Same in health with NICE. Sign up to that standard. That's what we should aim for. But then the money quite often either never follows it, or when the money follows it, it's seen to be wasted because, of course, you're such a micro jurisdiction. When you transpose those things, it looks really inefficient. So I kind of feel these are areas where this sort of aspirational, spendthrift, political agenda translates into actual operational risk. And that operational risk then falls in the heads of people like the Chief of Police or people like the Chief of the Fire Service or the accountable officer. And I just think if we could somehow break that cycle, it'd be important, because not only are we playing such a big role in people's lives, Jersey is losing its distinctiveness
And I would
because
like-
it's behaving like a big country when it's a small country. And again, I think we're getting a lot of, the public are not thanking us for making Jersey less distinctive as a place.
I agree with you that we need to compare ourselves to the countries that our size. Now, my question, we received recently a letter from yourself, and when I look quickly through the letter, we'll put it in legacy report, but most of our baseline comparison are to the UK. And my question was why we are comparing ourselves to the UK and not comparing ourselves to the small jurisdictions. Is it anything that could be presented to the next government that actually our comparison would be to the small jurisdictions, very small jurisdictions, that we can get a sense how we are doing compared to small jurisdictions and not UK?
Well, I think even our debate's making the case for the next government adopting the budget they find and spending 3 or 4 months doing what we're doing, because I think this is the heart of the matter. I'm not even sure that there's enough in comparing ourselves to other small places. My point is, where Jersey's been distinctive, it's been successful. Where it tries to be like everyone else, it loses its edge. It loses its economic edge, its cultural and its social edge, because it's trying to be like other places. So I think when you're a small island economy who remarkably has grown this 4 billion finance centre on it, truly remarkably, it's actually quite difficult to compare yourself to other people.
There's other jurisdictions that financial...
Yeah, no, but this is really important, because this obsession with comparative analysis, you know, rather than sitting back and saying, what have we got here? Who are we? What have we got? How can we earn our keep in the world? It's Oscar Wilde. Be yourself. Everyone else is taken.
Not when be yourself.
Jersey just needs to be itself.
I completely agree. We need to be itself, but we need also to understand why we are standing. We are very progressive, but at the same time, there are things happening around the world, and we don't have copy, but at least for the understanding how does it work, we can learn. And we can, for me, create a baseline for Jersey and compare ourselves to ourselves. Currently, what we got from the letter, that we don't have a baseline.
I suppose the question is...
Yeah, I mean,
how do
I
we
just
know
think
that-
you're taking
Just
a
a
very,
minute,
I think
yeah.
it's a very technocratic approach to an island that hopefully everyone loves. I just think you have to start with you and work your way out, not start with the world and work your way in. And I think that's one of our problems. We've adopted all this stuff. Let's be honest. We've had a lot of people come into the island from bigger places, informed by their experience of bigger places. That's how we do it there. We should do that here. And I keep going back to the fire service. I mean,
Does that
even
include
if you
your-
took the smallest fire service in England, there's still many things that we would ask our firefighters to do here that they wouldn't have to do.
But isn't that relevant to your own role as well? That when you have a successor, I'm sure we're going to be looking on Ireland, but it may be that we do end up with somebody else with those experiences that you just mentioned in there.
This is part of my advice that I've been open about to the SEB. I think you've got to be very careful. I genuinely feel, and you've asked my advice, is Jersey will only be relevant if it's distinctive. It can't be distinctive if it bases the way it runs itself and what everyone else is doing. And we've just got to have the self-confidence to say, actually, and that, you know, the thing that's really important about it, it's vitally important because you're trying to run a low-tax growth model. So there's no point, you're right, we compare ourselves to the OECD because we can participate on surveys and we can get comparative data, it's better than nothing. But then when you say, well, I have to adjust Sweden for the fact that they're paying 52p and we're paying 23, so obviously we need to make an adjustment. At that point, it starts to become pretty difficult.
Yeah,
Yes,
Dr. Wilson.
So I was just going to question whether or not your point about Jersey being itself, that the reason why Jersey is so unique is that it is capable of embracing all sorts of different perspectives and ways of doing things, and that there is a public expectation to be the best. How do you square that with public expectation and the resources that are available through taxation, through the percentage that comes from the gains through the International Finance Centre? You know, which population are we trying to serve in terms of that way of thinking about things?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that unites us as an island is our cognitive dissonance. Everyone wants stuff that they're not prepared to pay for, or they wanted it until someone sends them the bill, then they say, oh, actually, that's not what I wanted. And I think that the posh way of saying that is that our risk appetite is actually lower than we're prepared to admit. Because we don't want to pay for stuff. So
But everyone wants a decent home. They want
do.
good
They
healthcare,
do.
They want good
I
education.
just feel that islands, number one, all islands, but particularly independent islands, all islands have to rely much more on social capital than public capital or private capital. If you live in an island, you have to accept that you're on an island and that you have to muck in a different way from when you're not on an island. So the social capital of Jersey is an asset. That social capital in our structures vested in the parish and the parish structures and in voluntary organisations. Islands have to make more use of their social capital than their public capital, and that's one of the ways they have a smaller central government and they try and make use much more of the community. You have to invest in that. That has been eroded because we've adopted big country solutions. No question. No question. Look at the situation with the voluntary police. Look at the situation with all sorts of things. We're eroding our social capital. That makes us less distinctive. I don't think people want to visit a place that's not distinctive. Never mind live or build their life there. So I think it's really important that we go back to our vision of ourselves, I keep saying it, it's Oscar Wilde, I say it all the time in government, be yourself, everyone else is taken. Jersey needs to find a way to be itself again. And if it thinks being itself again includes being a low tax jurisdiction, it therefore has to prioritise differently for the role its government plays in islanders' lives. You know, if it wants parity here, it's unlikely that it's going to happen if you've got the regulatory structures of a bigger economy. That's unlikely, not impossible. And so we just need to get into that and say, hang on a minute, what is our proposition? And I just feel that you know, we've lost our way. You know, and we're on the wrong road, and it's giving us economic challenges, you know, it's giving us social challenges, and it will give us cultural challenges.
So coming back to the whole piece.
And that is my advice to answer your question. That is my advice to the next person, not doing my job, the next person doing Lyndon's job. That's what I'll say to them. If I were you, I'd put your foot in the ball for 6 months, work this stuff out with your team, and go back out to the public with something that's powerful.
In the
Going
interest,
back to your role now.
so in the interest of time, and also to move on to how we can find ourselves, we're gonna go to your objectives.
Oh, yeah.
So can you give an example of a recently set CEO objective?
Yeah, from the quarterly ones, I appreciate these. You have these, but they're not published, are they? This is the
Yes, so
issue.
the public needs to know about it as well.
So one of those objectives, I've lost my place now, we were into all sorts of stuff there, but one of my objectives has been to put together, for example, or to work with the State's Employment Board to have a sort of a rigorous, fair and open succession planning process for me. Is one of my objectives. That's an objective that I think began in Q3 of last year, September of last year, and it will run right up until the next Chief Minister appoints them, hopefully in the summer. So that's one of my objectives. I think it's important to see why is that an objective. Again, rightly or wrongly, because I wasn't here, there's a very strong feeling for colleagues that the process of appointing previous chief executives had not met those principles, and that people weren't really clear about what the process was, how to get involved in it, how you got prepared for it. So we had a situation, I think, in the space of, correct me if I'm wrong, 6 years where we hired 3 external to the service, and people feel that did they really have a chance? So there was those feelings we were trying to respond to, number one, which I think is important. If you want people to invest in the organisation, if they have the aspiration to do the top job, you have to help them have the best chance of doing that. So that was one part of the process. The second part of the process, I think, is related to what Glenn's just been asking me about. There is a debate to be had about what you need to do the job. And so one of the things we...
So sorry to interrupt, just to clarify on this part, how would you ensure that, how this objective is measured that will be done efficiently, and how do you ensure that knowledge and responsibilities are handed over efficiently?
Yeah, so the, I guess we'll know when the candidate's appointed, but I think if you look already at the track record, I think I've largely, if not exclusively, tried to promote people when jobs come available. I've tried to move people between jobs to give them different experiences. So you can already see that we are trying to give the thousands of colleagues already in the service the best chance to get new experiences and promotions within the services, and that's measured, so you can see that. So I think the succession planning process, at the end of it, you'll have a candidate, or you'll have a short list. Hopefully the new Chief Minister will feel better prepared than ever to make a decision in terms of the research we're able to give them on each candidate, the perspectives that we're able to give them on each candidate. And very importantly, for those candidates who are not successful, we can give them clarity in their development plan, what they need to be successful. So we've had 11, I think, colleagues go through assessment. A very small number of those will go into the short list, of course, it's the nature of things, but all of them will come out of it with absolute clarity on, this is what you're good at.
So we're not advertising?
No, so what will happen there is that will be a decision of that will be decision for the next Chief Minister. So what the SAB have decided is that from this process, we will appoint a deputy. We think it's important to answer your question for continuity between.
Like another interim position or?
No, I think we've been doing interims, and we've had assistant chief executives and all sorts of things. I think the SEB have decided that in future, as well as a chief executive, we should have a deputy chief executive. We should know who the under the bus person is, and that deputy chief executive ideally should be developed in such a way that either in a risk scenario or as part of the succession plan, they can become the chief executive, which is normal in most organisations. For whatever reason, we've not done it here. So when...
For clarity, I'm confused. Apologies that I'm interrupting because all recruitment for the position of the deputy chief executive, that hopefully will be chief executive, happen internally within the government structure. It hasn't been and will not be open for, let's say, first arm's length organizations or the island.
Okay, so let's take a step back. In looking at candidates, we've treated the public service as everything, including regulators,
business
all those people. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's the SEB's view that they should have a deputy in place, particularly during the transition from me to someone else. I think their aspiration is that having invested in this process and spent a lot of time in the development of colleagues, their hope and aspiration is that that deputy can come from the talent pool that they've just been assessing. Doesn't stop that person going for the top job when it comes, but there'll be a job there. The aim has always been that when the new Chief Minister comes in, we can give them a very clear steer on the quality of the internal candidates and who we believe would merit being on a shortlist. The Chief Minister is then well within the rights in consultation with the Appointments Commission of saying, that's very interesting, but I want to open this out to external candidates. What we have done as part of this exercise is we have benchmarked each candidate against the external market. So they've had interviews, dry run interviews for the job
Thank you.
by someone who interviews similar candidates. So we've tried to be as thorough as we can. But, to answer your earlier question, what will I be doing during Purdah? What I won't be doing is moving ahead with external advertisements for this job. I'll be making sure that the internal candidates list is strong and the next Chief Minister can decide what they want to do.
Got you. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Helpful.
And that's one of the objectives, obviously.
Okay, so related to other objectives, who sets your objectives, when were they agreed, and when will they next be reviewed?
Yeah, so the approach that we've taken was actually begun by Deputy Moore for her own sets of reasons. She, and partly because, of course, I'd come in secondment for 9 months, wanted to set objectives on a quarterly basis. Prior to that, I think they were 6 monthly. Wanted to set them quarterly, wanted them to be fairly specific to her government CSP and priorities, and be capable of delivering outputs within those 3 months or substantially progressing within 3 months. And that these would be, as far as possible, driven by the requirements of the CSP, the policy priorities of the Council of Ministers, by the statutory responsibilities, obviously, of the role. So she set up that way of working, that operating rhythm, and that would begin with, these, I think, are the priorities. Let's have a discussion about it, and then let's codify that into your objectives. She would then have got input from what was then her outer office on that. A draft would then be sent to me. We would debate it, and then we would say, okay, let's set that. Those are the objectives. And then it would be sent to the PAC chair, I can't remember who else it gets sent to, is it just the chair of the PAC?
Yeah.
So that was started by Deputy Moore. The current Chief Minister, when he came in, essentially said, that looks good enough to me, that's a better way of doing it. So we've just continued with that approach of the Chief Minister saying, these are the priorities we think for the COM in this period. Have we got this right? Are there other things that you think are priorities that you're concerned about? And we would come up with always these 5 things and say, those are the 5 things, iterate it and then share it.
So those are then reviewed quarterly, you said?
Quarterly, yeah.
And what measurable outcomes exist for this objective?
Different for different objectives. So if you take the curbing the growth one, for example, there were, over these different quarters, there was an objective to retire all vacancies from the system, which we did. There was an objective to implement recruitment freeze in certain areas but not in others, and then to track that through data. It was then extended through data. So I'll give you a sort of, I've got it. I'll have in here an example of how we would. So this is showing you headcount changes in those departments which aren't excluded from the recruitment freeze. So it'll show you the quarterly data. I can leave this with you or send it to you. It'll show you the quarterly data, and
Yeah,
you can see as the recruitment freeze starts to kick in, the headcount numbers dropping. So that's what he'll track with me quarterly. If you're using that as an example, he will sit down quarterly and say, what are the data? Where are we? Then we'll also do that at the States Employment Board. They'll track it as well. So that'd be an example, as I say, of continuation of the approach from Deputy Moore of what's the objective? Can it be enumerated? Obviously, some things aren't enumerated. For example, some things can end with, as part of that objective, the Council of Ministers wanted there to be a workshop with the Assembly, for example, so that the outcome is the actual workshop and the preparation for the workshop. Other ones have hard data measures.
And what formal performance review exists for the CEO, for the head of public services?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally that, going through it with the Chief Minister and going over whether or not they feel that you've met your objectives. He will take advice on some of the objectives like this one from the Vice Chair of SCB as well. We'll have an input to that. He will take advice from the Treasurer and other people. On the people objectives and what we're doing around the leadership development training that we've been doing, around the succession planning, in those areas he will get independent input from the Chief Officer for People Services.
And how is feedback incorporated in future objectives?
Sorry, so
How is feedback incorporated within future objectives?
in terms of, well, if he's not happy, he tells you where he's not happy. And if he's, to be fair, if he's happy, he also tells you where he's happy. But definitely an example of that will be, if we continue with this one, we put in place a recruitment freeze, which I think we've written to you about. You've seen the correspondence on that. We excluded health, education and non-MINS. As we went through the quarters, the progress wasn't felt to be strong enough. We had to point out that actually the progress is really strong. It's just been completely offset by health, education and non-MINS. So you either bring them into scope or you live with the fact that while you are reducing the civil service in some areas, you are expanding it in areas that you want it to expand. That's a political choice. We then got to the point after Q4 of last year where he felt that the recruitment freeze needed to make more progress and we should now extend it to the areas that the COM had previously said they didn't want to extend it to, so we had to go back to COM, have that debate again and say, look, what we need to extend it. COM agreed to that, so therefore my objective changed and I had to issue new guidance and have a new meeting with all the leaders to explain the new guidance to them and put in new controls So in the computer system that we use to track this, we put in new controls for anyone who's generating a new job that triggered them having different approvals. So that's literally how it works in practice. And to be fair to Deputy Moore and to Deputy Farnham, I think that's the advantage of a quarterly approach over maybe a 6-monthly approach. You can intervene quickly and say, that's not working, change it.
So what are your current objectives and what risks could prevent their implementation?
So the current objectives are to deliver, alongside others, of course, it makes it sound as if you do all this stuff yourself, which I don't, but obviously we want to deliver the financial services competitiveness review. There are 4 dimensions to that. It's quite a complex piece of work. I think it's going to be a really good piece of work, but that has to be delivered, or at least the publication of it and the explanation of it to 500 members of the industry has to happen on the 16th of March. Mm-hmm. So that's a very definitive output there. I'm then expecting, as I said earlier in answer to Glenn, I'm expecting the Minister to write to me and say, these are the things that I think you should get on with during Purda, and brief whoever my successor is on the priorities when you come back. So that's one of the objectives. Curbing the growth, the ongoing stuff that we've just been talking about, is one of the objectives. The succession planning and completing all the work by the end of this quarter so that we are confident we have a good short list of candidates, that we're confident every candidate who's been brave enough to go into the process has a very strong development plan. If they didn't make it to the final round, that they understand where they need to develop to get to the final round. That's one of the objectives. You need to call them up with me. I've forgotten 2 of my objectives. Have I missed one? I'm sure I've missed. What's the other one I've missed? This could mean it's done.
It's okay, we can get back
But
to
yeah,
this.
you can-
Deputy also has the.
those are the 3 main ones. I've temporarily forgotten one.
Andrew, could I just ask you a question about your objectives in relation to some of the less quantitative performance measures that you are assessed by? But, you know, a key part of being a public service leader is to bring cultural change as well. I think the first question is, have you had any objectives set around that particular dimension to your role? And what would you say in terms of the quality of the public service being left in your hands over the last 2 years, whether it's better or worse in terms of those quality issues that impact upon people's lives?
Sorry, the transition arrangements was the objective, I forgot, but we did discuss it earlier, so you know that there's a transition plan in place. So I think I've got an objective, and again, I think this one might have started under Deputy Moore, but it's been continued for senior leader development. I think it's called senior leaders development, and this has transcended both chief ministers I've worked with, which was a feeling that look, the civil service, as we discussed, are the grounds men and women. They're preparing the pitch for the players. They are always, of course, as focused on process as they are an outcome, because they're so heavily scrutinised, and because in the end everyone has to believe that the government is always trying to do the right thing. So there is a lot more process and scrutiny. But the previous chief minister, and I think it's a view that transcended chief ministers, felt that perhaps the balance between process and outcome had gone too far away from making sure there were indeed outcomes, measurable outcomes at anything. There was concern around pace of delivery, and there was a concern, those were the main concerns around those things. There were prior concerns around
Just 'cause we're
bullying and
short
other
for
stuff.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so-
on those things, I've really tried to focus, take my two bosses at their word and try and focus in bringing to the leaders in the organisation a greater sense of urgency and pride in getting stuff done, and being seen to get stuff done. And when we looked into that culturally, why is it that people feel that you don't get stuff it became clear that probably the hardest part of their job was prioritisation, or getting agreement on prioritisation with ministers. The hardest part of the job was that because the centre of government is unnecessarily siloed. You've heard me say that before. Too many departments, too many arm's length bodies, needs to be halved, in my view, in both instances. Numbers need to be halved, but until they are, you had this siloed type of approach of government, which meant that everyone prioritised their area, and those priorities would go shooting into areas like technology, HR, and the functions would just explode because they had far too many things coming in as priorities. The
But what would
organisation...
you say to the person on the street about your stewardship of the public service agenda over the last 2 years in terms of the quality improvements that have been made?
Well,
how would you
I mean,
reassure them?
It's been very short, obviously, so I don't think you can talk about legacies and these things when you've only been here 5 minutes, but certainly they will see that the CSP was prioritised and it's substantially done. So a smaller number of things, and those things get done. Certainly they will see that I've stood in front of the train of relentless growth in the public sector in terms of cash spending and headcount. We're still standing in front of the train, but at least we stood in front of the train and said enough is enough. We've got to start to address this, which I'd imagine, given that at the end of this year it'll amount to savings of 5p worth of income tax. I think that they'll be happy with that. I hope.
What about
that,
the quality of the service?
Well, I should also say that for the first time in a long number of years, trust scores for the public service went up in the last survey. So we seem to have bottomed out in that downward spiral. In terms of quality, look, that's in the eye of the beholder.
But when we've got a huge public overspend, long waiting lists, no provision for special educational needs, we're still struggling with the housing agenda.
Again, in education, we adopted lock, stock and barrel, a UK approach to special education needs.
So
And the UK have now reached an absolute crisis of funding and confidence in the standards and policies that we adopted lock, stock and barrel from them.
But you still
So
have
this is
children.
where I go back to where I started. Be yourself, everyone else is taken. Until we've got the confidence as a country to be ourselves, I think we're always going to let the public down.
I think the question is more about need and unmet need, and the quality of the service that is on offer to people at the moment. And we're just interested to know what your view is of the quality of that.
I think it's, but based on the feedback we're getting, I think it's improving. I think it's becoming less fractious, it's becoming less contentious. We're slowly but surely improving in those areas that we've been targeting. I think, when we have these, hopefully, bigger strategic discussions in the summer, in areas that I know that you care passionately about, like health, we've still got some very deep thinking to do about how, with our budgets and our resources in this island, we deliver top-class healthcare. I still don't think we've resolved the structural issues in healthcare. Maybe they're unresolvable, but I don't think we've yet got those. And I think you'll note that no new strategy for health has been brought forward during this assembly. Only new governance has been brought forward, but a new health strategy hasn't been brought forward. And you should be reassured, and the public will be reassured, one of the reasons for that is because we're doing deep analytical work inside the health service to say, you know, we really need a much more empirical and data-led approach to how we're going to reorganise this service. And that will be one of the defining issues for the next government.
So we'll have the strategy and not ad hoc decisions from the House.
Look, Jersey's politics and government is vision light and strategy light, and that is one of the reasons why there's so much trouble down below. So much stuff is non-prioritised, it's contested because you haven't sorted out the structure of government and you haven't sorted out the strategy. And if you haven't got the strategy, you don't have the priorities. And if you don't have the priorities, you don't have the money. If you don't have the money, you don't have the outcomes. And that is
I'm really happy to finish on this
what
because
has to be sorted.
I think something that I can agree to 100%, and this was my always way through this.
But that's
days,
not
that we did
particular
this
to this
strategy.
government. This government, for 2 years, has got a CSP with 10 things that it's done.
But we needed the
That
strategy,
characterises the last 30 years.
and hope we'll see the strategy going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Very
you.